Well, first, just some thanks to Emma Ekmekchen and Stephen Buter for inviting me today. I see a lot of friends in the audience who have been instrumental in helping me with this project. Frank Commande, George Jackson, Vicki Pierce, Dave James. I don't have everyone's visible names in front of me, but I'm so grateful to have your support, and I hope to entertain you a little bit today and give you something to think about. So I'm going to go easy on the theory, but I might slip into jargon at points. So I would just encourage folks, if there's a term that you're not familiar with, we've got a lot of humanists in the room and a lot of ecologists, biologists in the room. So if there's an unfamiliar term, I would encourage a rambunctious use of the chat. Okay, so I'm writing and I work and live on the ancestral lands of the Coast Miwok and the Muwekma Ohlone tribes. And this land continues to be of great importance and a site of struggle. Indeed, kelp is and abalone are sort of parts of that history. So I want to begin with that acknowledgement. I'm going to talk just very quickly about my dissertation, how the stories I tell today are related to a bigger inquiry I'm working on for the project. So my disc is called A Bluer Planet, Seaweed, Mariculture, and the Domestication of the Oceans, 1940 to 2000. And I'm asking this kind of unwieldy question of how planetary systems were imagined in the 20th century as systems of change. This is sort of geoengineering before geoengineering. And I get there through the domestication of the oceans. And I'm going to tell you that there are two ways to think about the domestication of the oceans that can be summed up into Beatles songs, The Yellow Submarine and the Octopus's Garden. In the 20th century, there were many fantasies about living undersea that were kind of tied with ideas about space colonization. Likewise, scholarship is really focused on that history, and the untold history is the octopus's garden, right? These are ideas of a sort of domesticated ocean. The stories we do get from the scholarship have tended to focus on the animal species, and rightly so. The domestication of salmon is a huge story for the 20th and 21st century. And my dissertation sort of flips this on its head, and I return to the 20th century to think about how algae or the plants of the ocean were imagined as a mechanism of cultivation to sort of feed the growing planet and indeed to control Earth's atmosphere. And a big part of this story is something as a case study of the Ocean Food and Energy Farm Project, which later became the Marine Biomass Program. It ran from 72 to 84 at a price of at least $45 million. And it was sponsored by, among other groups, the natural gas industry. There you go, gas, a renewable resource. And you might think, okay, this sounds like mid-century or 20th century moonshot, wild stuff. But here's the news from last week. Amazon has entered the seaweed game, spending 1.5 million euros on a Dutch seaweed project in the North Sea. These ideas have come back into our present in a very immediate way in the past couple years. Okay, so that's the gist of my disc, but we're going to head now over to the kelp forest, and indirectly I'll try to, why is it that Amazon and the gas industry, why is it they were interested in kelp? What good is kelp to the largest corporation on Earth? By telling about the kelp forest and the sort of story work it does, I'm going to try to answer that indirectly. But if you want to talk kelp farms or any of this other history, I'll hang out on the call afterwards for as long as you want to talk kelp farms. But we're going to head over to the ocean forest. So my question today is how is it that the canopy-forming macroalgae and their denizens, how did they become understood as forest, this terrestrial term? How did that work? What's the specific history? What purpose does this analogy serve within particular contexts? For whom and at what cost? Okay, so the big picture here, why does this matter? Ecologists will argue that going back to Darwin and the Voyage of the Beagle, we can locate an intellectual origin point for the conceptual model of kelps as forests, as ecosystems. Darwin's observations, ecologists have recently written, quote, forged the pillars of kelp ecology, end quote. And so today I'm going to try to convince you that the history of kelp ecology rests on other pillars as well, and that the history of the forest concept tells a different story, one that's shaped by colonial encounter and Western dreams of the mastery of nature. And I'm also going to make the case that ecologists and any of us working on issues related to kelp today need these broader stories. We can draw on them. And so I'm going to show you today how interests in giant kelp in Southern California were funded, driven, and shaped by wartime demands for potash and chemical resources in World War I. This is a point that Peter Neuschel made way before me. I'm also going to talk about how the metaphor works as an explanatory model of multi-species interdependence in marine environments. And the forest concept, I'm going to argue, does considerable cultural work. And this is what I'm referencing with the title of my talk, The Social Life of Marine Forests. Okay, and so today I'm going to put all the pressure I can on this term. I'm going to try to implode this term for us, but I also want to recuperate it. So here are some things I'm not saying. I'm not saying that ecologists can do without metaphorical language. I'm not saying that metaphor itself is the problem, that the kelp forest metaphor, that we can get out of metaphor. And I'm not going to tell you that we need to ditch the forest term and replace it with some kind of purified language, but I'm going to run it through some pressure to see how we can think with it differently. So the terrestrial significance of the analogy and the cultural work of the term, what it does is it makes oceans familiar to us. This might seem like an obvious point, but I'll stress it today. And it also stages a set of terrestrial and social assumptions that need to be diligently tended to. So we need to love our abstractions and our models, and this includes their messy histories. And I would go so far as to say that kelp has come to matter in California to generations of marine ecologists and broader publics, precisely because it's been conceptualized as a forest. So I'm trying to hold on to this term as much as I squish it today. And the general point is not to confuse the model for the world, Okay, that's sort of a high level introduction, but let's get right into specifics about how kelp stories work. Okay, so what do kelp stories do? And for environmental representation, the ocean is a big problem. It is vast. We don't experience it that much as humans, and it is very, very unfamiliar. Our language fails in the ocean, humanists, scholars in the blue humanities will often point out. So my claim is that kelp stories make oceanic problems thinkable on human scales. Kelp stories make the ocean thinkable on a human scale. And in so doing, they situate the human relative to those scales. Okay, let me show you how this works. So here's Jacques Cousteau, 1971, a year after the first Earth Day. He's writing in the New York Times, "Our oceans are dying." This is a clarion call in the 1970s, one that we maybe still haven't fully heard today. And so Cousteau wonders, why is it that oceans aren't getting recognition? And his answer is vastness. He says, people have thought that the legendary immensity of the ocean was such that man could do nothing against such a gigantic force. Indeed, this runs through the 20th century in thinking about turning to the oceans as a source of resources. The vastness of the ocean will match planetary problems in the 20th century. I'm adding to this that, okay, once we figure out the scale problem, we still have the familiarity problem. Okay, so in Cousteau's article, he uses a kelp story to make this link between human use, human enterprise, and planetary problems. And he's going to tell the most famous kelp story of all time. And you all know that story, I'm sure. So here is Cousteau. Another example in California is frightening. As you know, there is a California ecosystem, very simple, that is often cited as an example: the sea otter, the kelp, the urchin, and the abalone. 200 years ago, the sea otter was abundant all along the coast of California. Now it has been eradicated, almost eradicated in the south. Cousteau does not mention, he does not name here American, Spanish, and Russian fur trappers. It's abstracted into the term man. Okay, the absence of the sea otter in the south makes a threat to the kelp beds by encouraging the urchins to eat the kelp roots. And sea otters are not there to eat the sea urchins and keep the balance. Some scientists, in despair, found out two solutions. One was to spread chemicals on the bottom of the sea, and the other solution was to send divers with hammers down to crush the urchins by the thousands, to kill them on the spot. Cousteau adds his commentary: it is a tremendous waste. Some of you on the call today will know that Cousteau is referencing Wheeler North's work here. Okay, but so so what do kelp stories do? Okay, so here we see how kelp communities are models to think with. They're sort of, it's a concept, it's a way for Cousteau to tell an allegory. And in so doing, they aggregate multiple species into a frame of reference. And sometimes, as I made the point, human figures fall inside the frame, sometimes out. And as models, they depend on simplification. Furthermore, kelp stories do scale work, as I said. They serve as local allegories for larger global narratives, right? The sea is dying. And they can be mobilized as interscalar vehicles to sort of move between scales. And they also reference the human. They also are a sort of ground against which the figure of the human is visualized. And so, yeah, in these various ways, this is one of the things to attend to. Kelp forests indirectly figure other abstractions, that is the planet and the human. Okay, to sum it up in simple terms, when we're talking about kelp forests, even when humans aren't present, we're talking about humans. I'm going to overstate the point to make it. All right, so now into the discourse. Two terms, two categories are used to reference kelp communities: beds and forests. If we take a sort of macro view, this is Google Ngrams, you can see that the kelp bed term, its relative frequency in all of the books digitized in the Google Books corpus, it sort of falls out of fashion in the 80s. And the kelp forest sort of rushes on the scene in the 70s. This is kind of a general picture, which gives us kind of a rough map for reading, but it is on its own terms is not evidence. And so today, instead, I'm going to take you to 4 examples to do some close reading work. And the first will be this origin story from Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle, 1845. Then we'll move over to 1870 and Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which is the most famous treatment of a kelp forest in literary history, I would say. We'll jump to the early 20th century and California's kelp harvesting industry to think about how kelp was thought about in terms of beds, to see what work that concept does. And then I'll wrap up by talking about Wheeler J. North in the 60s and the 70s. That'll give us a sort of gateway to think about how this term, the forest, stabilized in the scientific discourse and what it did there. So we'll head right now over to Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle. I'm going to just skip this slide, but we can talk about it later. This is how these two terms appear in the scientific discourse. You can see basically the gist is that in about 2000, you see the kelp forest term separate from the kelp bed term, and this is in scientific articles. I'm going to sort of move past this, heading over to Darwin. All right, so here's Darwin in the Voyage of the Beagle, and this is what ecologists will reference as their sort of origin point, their intellectual origin story. So after naming a range of species and their intricate relations, Darwin writes, quote, "I can only compare these great aquatic forests of the southern hemisphere with the terrestrial ones of the intertropical regions. Yet if in any country a forest was destroyed, I do not believe nearly so many species of animals would perish as would here from the destruction of the kelp. Amidst the leaves of this plant, numerous species of fish live, which nowhere else could find food or shelter. With their destruction, the many cormorants and other fishing birds and otters, seals and porpoises would perish also." And right here is where ecologists will stop their quotation of Darwin. And then so they sort of sanitize this passage, but we need to keep reading. And lastly, Darwin writes, the Fuegian savage, the miserable lord of this miserable land, would redouble his cannibal feast, decrease in numbers, and perhaps cease to exist. So Darwin here was making a point about kelp and interspecies relations, but he was also making a point about indigenous people. And the scholarship on Darwin has had a lot to say about his comments on the Yagan people. And indeed, apologists for Darwin, like Anne Chapman, will make the case that Darwin repudiated his comments on the Fuegians later. They'll blame Captain Cook for putting these ideas in Darwin's heads. And the best reference on this is Joseph Iannolini's work from 2013. We'll give you sort of an overview of these debates. Okay, but for my purposes, I want to make three simple points. Darwin's passage makes the comparison to terrestrial forests to think about productivity and its utility for navigation elsewhere in the passage. And two, Darwin's kelp story references interdependence, right? It's this ecological image. It's almost like his entangled bank metaphor. And we need to keep track that this set of relationships also pointed to humans. And this is my point from earlier, in which I said, when we talk about kelp forests, we're always talking about humans, my sort of overstated point. And the third point is a simple one, that the kelp forest comes out of colonial encounter. Okay. So now I want to shift over to Jules Verne and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. So we've got I'll introduce you to two characters. So we've got Professor Pierre Aronnax, who is the French natural scientist and narrator of the story, and then Captain Nemo, the captain of a submarine who's cruising around and is a very mysterious figure. And in chapter 15, Nemo writes a letter to Aronnax on board, and he says, "We're going to go on a hunting trip." And Aronnax is very confused. He's, whoa, okay. So indeed, Nemo does make his way to the land. He will make his way onto land. He'll set foot on dry land. And he's going through in his head thinking about this. In chapter 17, we get a story about a voyage into the kelp forest. So Nemo shows up and says to Aronnax, no, we're not going to dry land. I'm going to take you to the forests under the seas. We should keep in mind that the narrator references the genus Nereocystis and Hydra. So these are references to bull kelp and sea otters, and this sort of sets us in the Northwest, if you will, in a sort of imaginary landscape that's drawing from that from those sources. So not literally, sorry. Okay, and the chapter plays on this confusion between the land and the undersea. And so while plants underwater do not flower, and it seems like animals appear to do so. Quote, the animal kingdom blossoms and the vegetal kingdom doesn't. So this is an exploration of the weirdness of the undersea, and the forest kind of helps domesticate that. It helps familiarize this space. Okay, so I'll read this. This is the opening paragraph from the chapter. We had finally arrived on the outskirts of this forest. Okay, so the four of them, they don their diving gear, they head out of the submarine with their electric rifles, and they're going to go on this hunting trip. We had finally arrived on the outskirts of this forest, surely on the finest in Captain Nemo's immense domains. He regarded it as his own and had laid the same claim to it in the first days of the world. The first men had to their forests on land. Besides, who else could dispute his ownership of this underwater property? What other bolder pioneer would come, axe in hand, to clear away its dark underbrush? Okay, and the chapter struggles a little bit with plot because the characters cannot speak to one another. They have their diving suits on, and so the hunting journey kind of carries it through. So we see them marching along. Nemo shoots an otter out of the canopy and sort of captures it in real visceral terms to sort of make his claim on this space. And then the four of them, they find shade under the wet shadiness of the kelp, and they take a nap. And this is a classic figure of the idol in sort of from a pastoral tradition, which we'll touch on later. And then the assistant shoots an albatross out of the sky as it comes to skim along the surface of the ocean. And Aronnax says, oh, look, the breaking waves on the surface of the ocean are just like the clouds. And so these characters, they have to sort of become sort of familiar with this environment. And what I'm saying is basically that the kelp forest makes the ocean terrestrial in a way, and in so doing, it becomes thinkable as property, and it becomes thinkable as a stage on which Nemo can demonstrate his mastery of the vast expanse. And again, so it becomes a stage for measuring human endeavors. And then just an aside, the ship, we learn later, is powered by coal mines, undersea coal mines. And this coal, where does it come from? It comes from the historic kelp forests. So this is an idea of a submarine powered by fuel produced by kelp, which is something we'll return to in the 20th century. Okay, so the takeaways: the forest makes the ocean familiar, and it brings in ideas of property and mastery for Verne. All right, we're going to move on to the early 20th century now. Okay, so in the early 20th century, the kelp forest concept was not in play. The interest driving research in kelp was for potash and as a resource. And so in 1911, the state of California begins mapping the kelp beds from Baja up to Alaska. This character, Captain W.C. Crandall, is part of the team that is doing this mapping. And this is a letter from someone at the Hercules Powder Company. It's written in September 19th of 1918. This is a couple months before the end of World War I. And so these resources were hugely valuable. Potash came to the US from Germany. These sources were unavailable during the war. And so an industry starts in San Diego to harvest and process this kelp to produce smokeless gunpowder and fertilizers important to the war efforts and to the domestic situation. Okay, and so I'm going to take you to, I'm going to give you a sort of lesson, a little bit of a lesson about why what I'm talking about is not just semantic. I'm going to try to persuade you that these metaphors enact worlds, that they perform things, they do things. Okay. And so here's this letter. And so Bunfield is complaining to Crandall that these other jabronis are just sending their clipper right through the center of the beds, and it's making it very difficult for the Hercules Powder Company to harvest efficiently. And this is a beautiful move. He writes, "We believe that you feel as we do." That the beds should be cut clean and that they should be approached the same as a harvester would approach a field of grain. Cutting from the outside in, and thus clean up everything as the harvester goes along. And so for folks in the room who are familiar with STS, or sort of literary approaches, it's what I'm talking about here is the performativity of these terms. So let me back up. This letter is exemplary of how kelp communities were identified and imagined in the early 20th century. They weren't thought about as forests. They were thought about in these terms. But we can see here that the bed concept kind of fails. It doesn't do everything the speaker needs. Human relations aren't obvious in the metaphor. So the speaker reaches for another one, the field of grass. And they are indeed, these terms are indeed performative. So we see how these tropes are tied to doing, and that language here is done through practice. It is enacted. It is enacted, right? So this metaphor will be realized when it is practiced, when it is practiced in the cutting of the kelp. Okay, so as just a little bit more context, so Crandall was key to this mapping effort. I'm just kind of shifting now from my points. And they produced a lot of research on the kelp abundance up and down the coast. And if you look at the writing from Crandall and others, you will never see the forest term used. It's always beds. But arboreal metaphors kind of percolate up in other ways. They'll talk about stands of kelp to reference the density and sort of purity of the resource, taking this term from forest management, you could say. And also, Crandall will refer to groves of kelp. Groves of kelp, I love this, to talk about super beds. So when a bed is too big to be considered a bed, he'll call it a grove. Okay, this is just to say that forest ideas are not mutually exclusive from the bed idea. But here we get a sort of a picture of what early 20th century, the way kelp was thought. All right, and now we're going to make our way further into the scientific discourse, and I'll talk a little bit about Wheeler J. North. Okay, and Wheeler North is someone who was born in San Francisco in 1922 and passed away on December 20th, 2002. He enters Scripps in 1950, and he was involved in early experiments with neoprene wetsuits, and he was among some of the very first divers to use the aqualung for research. Though I should say the phycologist C.K. Tseng was doing hard hat dives in the kelp decades before without a wetsuit. Pretty cool. So Around 1956, Wheeler North the Scripps Institute in Oceanography receives a grant from the state of California to conduct a kelp study. North, in his own words, had never taken a course in ecology, but he worked with ecological concepts on his doctoral thesis on sea anemones. And he found himself in this role working on this study, in part because he could dive. And this study shapes the next 40 years of his career. What sparked this study was a resource conflict between the kelp industry, what became of Hercules Powder Company, was now okay, and recreational fishers. They were butting heads. The fishermen said, "Hey, kelp harvesters, you're the reason we're not catching enough fish." So the state of California was called in to adjudicate. And so North and his colleagues showed in this early study that kelp harvesting, according to them, did not affect the recreational fisheries. There was then a big El Nino between 57 and 59, and there were major die-offs in the giant kelp beds in Southern California. So Kelco gives research funding to North to see about controlling the urchins. He moves to Caltech in 63, and Kelco ends its grants in 75. And so out of this research comes a vast set of reports. Wheeler North's favorite genre was the report, the annual report. This was his writing mode that he liked the most. So these 11 reports, I'll note, were just digitized, if you're interested in this more, by the folks at Hopkins Marine Station, and they're free to access, and you can download them through SearchWorks through the Stanford website. Okay, and so here we are, 1960s, 1970s. This is kind of the hotbed of kelp research, and over these 11 reports, there are 22 occurrences of the forest term, and which is not much, And notably, 14 of these occurrences, 2/3, talk about novel kelp communities as forests. So North uses it like this. He'll take the term and he'll reach back and say, we have restored a forest. This creates a link between an imaginary of a past abundance and a newly created forest. And it gives North, the forest concept gives North a way of talking about his entrance into these ecosystems, basically. So I'll show you a quick example of that. Here's a letter North's writing to that across Wheeler North's writing. This is the predominant way that he'll reference the forest. Okay, why is this interesting? Okay, so North is a pivotal figure. In 1971, he assembles the first edited volume on kelp, on Macrocystis pyrifera, rather, which becomes a sort of textbook for future kelp ecologists. And this is structured around the bed concept. It's not structured around the forest concept. But in North's public life, he used this term extensively. So there's almost this science and public science divide for North in the way he uses this term. The bed is like a scientific term, and forest is something that allows him to talk about manipulation and intervention. And so in 1972, he's commissioned by National Geographic to tell his story. And this is where the sort of kelp otter urchin story sort of finds its greatest public audience in 1972. So let's take a look over there to this document. So this is again the first paragraph, and it speaks volumes to what I'm trying to argue. So here's North. At day's end, I often relax finish a circumstance that seemed inevitable a few years ago. Okay, I see we're getting close to time, so I'll wrap up. I'll bring this ship home to port. But basically, in this article, North tells a story of his research, and he says people thought, hey, kelp was declining because of pollution, or kelp was declining because of overharvesting. And he says, no, I've discovered this relationship between otters, the lack of otters, urchins, and deforestation. And then he talks about the interventions he takes with his colleagues to suppress otters through the use of quicklime and diving, which we saw Cousteau referring to. And he arrives at this interesting moment where he says, you know, now we knew that man was not the direct cause of the kelp decline, but unfortunately, he has contributed to it. And then he says that, okay, to do this, the Kelco Company, a large California kelp processor, awarded a generous grant to the University of California for an intensive research program. Man has at last, man was at last filling the niche left vacant by the slaughtered sea otters. Okay, this is fascinating. Humans taking on the role of the sea otter. I'm just going to summarize my final points for you now, and then we'll shift over to Q&A. I'm happy to have a dialogue. So kelp forests identify communities, and they describe how relations within those communities work. In Darwin's case, who is dependent on whom? And we see how humans have fallen into and out of this community. We see that over and again. And we've also seen how the kelp forest does scale work, how it becomes an allegory for thinking about global ecology. And we've seen how it serves to stage a setting against which to measure human enterprise. It becomes a way of talking about environmental decline. And we've seen how the forest concept tells stories about the mastery of nature, how it renders the ocean familiar. So the upshot here, I'm going to try to quickly redeem this concept.
Hey, David, I'm
Yes.
sorry to interrupt right now. I'm wondering if this is a consequence of there was a bad connection at some point. I think most of us experienced. Your slide is currently blank right now. So
Yeah.
if you, okay, I just wasn't sure if that was on purpose. Okay.
Okay, yeah.
I'm sorry for interrupting. My bad.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to try to bring this back to port as quickly as I can. So yeah, maybe okay, so we've seen how the kelp concept does scale work. And so let me say this. Let me try to redeem it real quick. So kelp forests are how these ecosystems come to matter in California. The term stabilizes through the pedagogy of folks like John Pierce with the Kelp Forest Ecology course at Hopkins Marine Station, and with the exhibition in the Monterey Bay Aquarium opening in 1984 of the kelp forest tank at the aquarium. And this is the double-sided nature of this, is that making things familiar also reduces them. and leaves things out. Okay, that's the kind of tightrope that we have to walk. I'm going to cut myself off there. I got more to say about metaphor, but I'll just stop. Okay. So thank you for your attention. And if you want to reach out, if you have criticisms or comments, you can reach me at ds1@stanford.edu. I'll stop sharing screen. And thank you. Thank you so much for your attention.